Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast, part of the National Bleav Network. And joining me for Rockets Conversation, USA Today's Rockets Wire and host of the Locker Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You also know him from Sports Talk 790 as well. Great to see you, Ben. And before I move into the big picture, since we're doing this after the Sun games, I figured I wanted to congratulate, or maybe you want to congratulate the refs for ejecting Steven Adams after his totally unnecessary and out of control violence against Plumlee. How crude of him.
I know. I think that was one where if they ejected one, they felt like they had to do the other, or it would be putting their thumb on the scale. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. I will say I was relieved that they got the call when Tony Brothers went to the review monitor for the Jalen Green 3 at the start of the second half. I was paranoid because Jalen did stick his leg out a little bit. Now, the contact was going to be made regardless, so clearly it should have been and was a foul. But when I saw Jalen extend the leg just a little bit, I was worried with Tony Brothers in the house that it might end poorly. This time, Tony got it right, so kudos to him for that.
Yeah, Tony, just so you know, fights aren't typically when you hug a guy, and I think that's what Steven Adams did. I think that was really a very loving thing that he was trying to do there. So, he said it was considered a fight, and by rule, fighting techs carry an automatic ejection for whatever that's worth. But let's switch gears to the Rockets' big picture. In the last 5 games, Sengun shooting 65.2%. Is this real? And how much is this the double big lineups, or is it because the schedule's been cotton candy soft?
So I think 65% is probably exaggerated, just as, season long, him being at like 48 was exaggerated too. We have like a 2-year sample in which he was at 54.5%. I think that's pretty reasonable. And so now he's getting back to where he should be. I think at some point he was going to have a hot streak. The schedule certainly helps. What excites me the most, Robert, is actually the assist numbers. Since the calendar turned to March, he's averaging over 6 per game, and you're really seeing some of those highlight assists, the no look. It feels like he's playing much more freely, and I think him making more shots may play into that some, in that he's more confident that if he attacks, that he can actually finish. I think being healthier, we know he was struggling with the back prior to the All-Star break. That's part of it as well. But I also think that there's been a big adjustment for Sengun the last couple of years, being the top guy for the Rockets, being the top guy on opposing scouting reports, playing for a Rockets team that had expectations. In contrast to his first 2 NBA seasons under Stephen Silas, it didn't really matter if they won or lost, so there wasn't much pressure. Half of it, he was coming off the bench. Everything was just much more simplified. The stakes were lower. And so it was easier for him to just play, as opposed to the last 2 years being one of the top guys on the Rockets, top guy in opposing scouting reports. The reads became much more complicated, and he also went through this weird finishing issue this year, and it felt like he was just sort of paralyzed by indecision, and his processing at times has been a tick slow, not just for himself, but in terms of like making the kick-out pass to his teammates. What it feels like to me since the All-Star break, he's been much more decisive. He's looked much more comfortable. And I think finishing certainly helps. But I just think more time as the top option, as an All-Star level player, it feels like he's getting more comfortable. And so it's those assist numbers ticking up and him making those more instinctive plays. That's what excites me the most about Alperen Sengun since the All-Star break. And I do think that's sustainable, even if the 60+% shooting isn't.
You wonder maybe if Udoka took the governor off of him a little bit, because the first year and a half, maybe he said, well, we're trying to cut down turnovers. Don't do all the fancy stuff. Let's do that. And then he said, maybe a week or 2 ago, he goes, well, I want you to do you a little bit more because we need to get back to that.
I think that's possible. I think Fred VanVleet made the argument when he was first trying to come back a couple of weeks ago before he re-aggravated the ankle, or a different part of the ankle, but same ankle nonetheless, in that March 1st game, that the time without Fred may have been beneficial to the Rockets because it forced these other guys into taking on greater playmaking roles. And so Sengun's one of them. You can point to Jalen Green and Amen Thompson as well when Amen was healthy. But I think not having Fred as the security blanket may have forced these guys to go out and trust themselves. I think a lot of what's happened with the stakes being so much higher And even this year compared to last, because this is a year where the playoffs are the expectation now, I think at times you've seen guys like Sengun and Jalen play not to make a mistake. And they don't want to be the guy by having an errant pass that decides a game that at the end of the year you look back on and say, this is what kept us out of the playoffs or kept us from home court advantage or whatever it may be. Whereas this month plus without Fred, I think it sort of forced them to be the guys. Sink or swim, somebody's going to go out there and make a play. If not us, who? Especially when it coincided with Sengun getting healthier again after the All-Star break. That might have been the last little push to say, hey, just go out, play free. You may have some turnovers. I think he had, 4 or 5 last night, but you're also going to make some big-time plays as well. And in the grand scheme, the plays you make and what that means for your teammates probably provide more overall value, even if you are turning the ball over a little bit more.
Yeah, let's connect Sengun and what else is going on, because when Rafael Stone nearly signed Brook Lopez, I was all for the move. I was on this Brook Lopez island, I felt, among Rockets fans that believe that there's no way this is going to hinder Sengun's development. But I figured he would complement Sengun. I thought the defense alongside him and the physicality might help Sengun a little bit. Now, Steven Adams, he's got a slightly different skill set, but defensively, they're similar. And so everybody's talking about the two bigs. Ben, does what you're seeing make you rethink a little bit how the Rockets should build around Sengun, or is Adams, do you feel like a unicorn among bigs?
I'm not there yet. I need to see how it looks against better opponents. We're basically seeing right now a perfect storm when it comes to Amen Thompson being out of the lineup. So there aren't very many alternatives for Ime Udoka, and yet it's a portion of the schedule that's very friendly to the Rockets. A lot of home games, especially when there isn't much tape on this double big lineup in terms of how opponents might want to attack it. A lot of things have added up to it looking really, really good right now. And I think in some ways there will be benefits no matter who they play in terms of certainly the offensive rebounding, the physicality. But I do worry about how it's going to hold up against teams that have a lot of speed, a lot of shooting, and can truly spread them out and attack off the dribble. Maybe there's the length, especially if you play Jabari at the 3, to where you can overcome it just simply based on how many arms there are and your ability to crash the glass, and perhaps the rebounding advantage offsets the lack of defensive versatility. But I need to see it against higher profile opponents and on a much more sustained basis before I, really buy into it long term. That said, I think it's a very useful tool. And what's really stood out to me the most, Robert, is actually Jabari Smith Jr. at the 3. I wasn't sure he'd be as fluid as he has been on the perimeter. And at times we saw him late in the Phoenix game take it right at Kevin Durant and make plays off the dribble a couple of times for himself. Another time he had a nice dish to Jock Landale. If Jabari Smith Jr. could be a playmaker at the 3, and so you have 3 guys out there who are 6'10", 6'11", 7 feet in that range, that might be how you can overcome some of the foot speed limitations of Steven Adams and Alperen Sengun in the modern NBA. So I would say it's also tied in with how viable is Jabari at the 3, even Tari Eason at the 2, because I do think you're going to have issues covering ground against better teams. But if you're that large across the board and conceivably you could run a 6'7" Amen Thompson at point guard when he's back, maybe that much collective height across the board can sort of offset the lack of foot speed. That's the hope, but I need to actually see it play out against good opponents and more consistently before I really buy in on like a longer term basis.
Yeah. And part of, I think, the issue with the Rockets is, especially without Fred VanVleet in a way, even though you don't think of him as like rebounding guy, he would get more rebounds, it felt like, than Jalen Green. But because Dillon Brooks just doesn't rebound
right
as a 3, when you don't have somebody else back there, Dillon's more like a 2 on offense, in that way, or on defense at times, because he just doesn't have the rebounding, and sometimes on offense as well. But I also wanted to ask you, going back to the 2 bigs specifically, Landale does not make sense in 2 big lineups, but even though he's not playoff eligible, I wanted to ask you, would you like to see the Rockets bring up N'Faly Dante and give him some 5-minute runs with Sengun just to see what that looked like?
If you get to the final 10 days and you're basically secure in your top 6 seed, then I'd be open to that. I wouldn't do it quite yet just because the stakes are so high and these are games you need to win. I think the Rockets are going to play the hits, so to speak, and go with what's worked and what Ime Udoka feels like he can trust. But I will say, the way the Rockets are looking at this internally, as long as they get in the top 6, there's not a huge difference to them in seed. You can be the 2 seed, and yeah, you'd be slotted to have home court advantage. They've been good at Toyota Center. But if you play the Warriors or the Timberwolves, you're probably going to be an underdog. Or you can be the 6 seed, and if Memphis is the 3, you'd probably be favored because you've looked good against them all season long. So I think the way the Rockets are looking at this, as long as they don't fall into the play-in tournament, as long as they get in a best-of-7 series, whether they are the 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, isn't that important to them. It comes down to matchups, and maybe they'll want to bump up a seed or down a seed depending on how the standings shake out at the end of the year. But I say all that as pretext to make the case for experimentation in those final 10 days. If you have a decent buffer over the Timberwolves or whoever it is at 7, the closest play-in team to you, then yeah, at that point, I could see value in it. I just don't think they're going to do it in the stretch where right now they still need to secure their spot in the top 6. And these are games that, quite frankly, they need to win. If they lose at home against a team like Dallas or Chicago or Philly coming up, then all of a sudden, a Timberwolves team at 7 that's hot can get back in the race real quickly. So I don't think they're going to do it in the very short term. But as you get down the home stretch of the year and some of the regulars, you probably try and save some mileage to have them ready for the playoffs. I could see it then, yeah.
Yeah, I guess my thing is these 5-minute windows don't mean a lot to me. I mean, they ran Cam Whitmore out for 5 minutes last night. It was terrible. He was terrible. And, I think Dante provides more to winning defense the way Udoka likes to do winning defense than that. And so, and you never know, like Sengun, I don't feel like there's something major to lose if he's playing out there with Sengun, because you still have Sengun to help out. And the other part about it is with N'Faly Dante, you never know when Steven Adams is going to get thrown out of a game, Ben. You just never know. You never know when that might happen because he's hugging somebody. And also, I just want to know, do you want to send a thank you card to Nico Harrison for this brilliant trade, forcing Udoka into the double big experiment?
I know. It's helped the Rockets on so many fronts. Most notably, the Rockets have that 2029 Dallas pick from the Brooklyn draft deal they made last summer. So all of a sudden, that 2029 Dallas pick, we talk about how good the future outlook for the Suns picks is that the Rockets own and how that puts them in a leverage position on the trade market. All of a sudden, that future Dallas pick looks a lot better too. And so I think that's where Rafael Stone appreciates Nico Harrison the most. But yeah, forcing the hand in that Anthony Davis game, somehow, how #Houston Sports is it that the one game that Anthony Davis played in Dallas and was brilliant, not even a full game, 3 quarters, came against the Rockets, and AD was brilliant enough in those 3 quarters to get Dallas a win. Yet, to your point, maybe it did serve the greater good in that I think how functional the double big looked in that sort of opened the eyes of Ime Udoka to where, I'm more willing to give this a try. And now, a month later, it feels like this is a much more regular option for him. I think the Amen injury certainly tipped the scales even more. But yeah, that Dallas game was certainly where it started.
I want to go back to the triple bigs and sort of how it connects to an issue that I had with Udoka. And in just a second, before we roll on, I just want to remind everybody, I want to hear your Rockets takes. What do you guys think about the double big, triple big? Let me know in the YouTube comments. Support us and get updates on every show that drops by subscribing on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up. Listen in your car or while you're out and about with your favorite podcast app. Okay, Ben, the double big is sometimes transforming into the triple big, like you were talking about with Jabari and the success there. I kind of wanted to know, you sort of think this is something, but this is my sort of thing. Honestly, one of the biggest frustrations with Udoka is the lack of lineup experimentation until recently, like we've seen with this. And when you watch Oklahoma City's Mark Daigneault, for instance, I just appreciate his willingness to run out different big and small combos. He still manages to compete with these guys, but he's willing to experiment. I wish Udoka would put his opposing coach more on his toes, Ben, instead of always being so reactive. It seems like not only is he not experimenting, but it's almost like, he reacts to what they do instead of him instigating like, hey, let's try this out and see what they do to that.
I think one of the big differences there is that OKC has a much bigger margin for error. That team is so loaded. You look at their net rating differential, which is historic. You look at the record and the 11-plus game lead they have in the West. I just think he has a lot more freedom because if it goes bad, we're not second guessing.
Now they do, but like last year they were doing this stuff. They've done this over the years.
They have, yeah, but I would say even last year, that was a 57-win team. That's a higher bar than the current Rockets, where if you go on a 2-game losing streak, especially this homestand, you could be in the play-in mix. I think that's a little bit of the difference. And to your point on Cam Whitmore a few minutes ago, I think that was an example of Ime trying something different. I think they viewed, and internally, another difference between Cam Whitmore and N'Faly Dante, they just have higher expectations for Cam. He's a bigger part of the long-term puzzle. And so I think they saw the Phoenix game as a matchup where they're in an advantage position no matter what. Phoenix is a bad defense, and maybe that's one where Cam and his athleticism can go make plays. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. He even missed a dunk. But I think, to your point, that's Ime trying something a little bit out of his comfort zone. Unfortunately, it backfired, and we didn't see it in the second half when the Rockets wanted to pull away. But I think that's the difference, is this Rockets team just doesn't have much of a margin for error. And so with Ime, he's gone back to playing the hits, as I said a few minutes ago. And I do agree with you that there are times it makes sense to branch out. For example, the Oklahoma City game earlier in the month, I thought it was great to give Reed and Cam a longer runway. And I love that Reed had that confidence building game before the issue with his thumb, because I think it makes all of us feel a little bit better about him moving forward. I think it's something that you'll naturally see a little bit more if and when the Rockets get to a step where, last year they were just trying to be competitive and grinding everything out. And this year, they're just trying to stay above the play-in range and making sure they get back to the playoffs for the first time in 5 years. If the Rockets get to a world where they're, mid-50s, solidly in the playoff field, I think that's where Ime Udoka will have a little bit more freedom because of the buffer to experiment more during the season, knowing that even if it goes poorly, there is a backstop. The team is good enough. I think right now the concern is whether the foundation is sufficient enough for him to take those types of risks.
Yeah, it's my feeling though. It's just there are nights when things aren't working and it's not going well, and it's those nights where you just go, "Hey, let's try something." And Jabari at the 3, I think is the fan base. Like I've heard fans all year talk about, "Hey, let's try this." I mean, this is not something that nobody would have thought of. I mean, the fan base was like, "Yeah, Jabari playing the 3 sort of makes a little bit of sense for him," and because of the type of player he is, I guess.
Yeah, you can certainly make the argument. I think internally they'll point to sample size and say, just because something's not working on a given night, let's use Jabari, for example. He shot 1 of 5 in the first half against Orlando the other night. And I asked Ime Udoka about how he was able to flip it to, a brilliant second half. And he said, well, the shot quality was the same, so it really wasn't that difficult. It's just the sample got larger and the shots went in. They dialed up one play for him. And I think, that's a micro example. In the macro, I think the same principle holds, in that even if a guy is having a bad game, well, if the larger sample says this guy's good in this role, then we're going to trust it. But yeah, to your point, there are certainly some nights over 82 when certain players just don't have the juice. It's just not going their way, or maybe they're hurt, maybe they're in foul trouble, something like that. And so in those situations, yeah, it feels like Ime's been a little bit rigid. He's got his guys, his roles. And so, yeah, you can point to the success Jabari's had at the 3, the success of the double big lineup as sort of eye-opening, and say, maybe it is worth trying something new, using guys in different ways. It can work. And maybe this is something that's eye-opening to the staff moving forward beyond just the players that have done it the last week or so.
And I've been a big advocate of Udoka. And frankly, I think he's a top-tier NBA coach. The fan base needs to trust him more than they do after what he's done so far. And I will say that as a prelude, because I just feel like he made a horrific mistake this week. And Ben, once I lay it out, feel free to add any context, but I just have to get this off my chest and sort of spell it out for everybody. Amen Thompson should have never been in the Pelicans game with 5 minutes left and the Rockets up 30. Number one, he's played 38 minutes a game as a starter since early January. This would lead the NBA if this was a whole season. He's not a robot. Tom Thibodeau proves every year that when you overplay guys, it takes a toll. Injuries happen. We saw last year also that Amen turned his ankle his rookie season and missed a month. So it's not like this guy has shown that he's just nonstop durable. Number two, the organization made the decision less than a week earlier, few days earlier, to sit their whole roster against OKC for the same concerns, load management. Number three, the Rockets were up by no fewer than 28 points from the 11:20 mark of the fourth quarter. And there had been 2 timeouts after that prior to the rolled ankle. Of course, they're also playing the Pelicans, who, are they going to come back from 28 points in the fourth quarter? Do they care? Probably not. I mean, this is team tank mode right now. Number four, there are 3 real ball creating point guards on the roster. Van Vliet was in the midst of missing a month with an ankle injury. And you knew before the game started, Reed Shepherd was done for the regular season, basically. And so you have Amen is the guy that's left. You got to protect him like he's the glass vase there. And we'll see if it's, a lucky situation and it's only 2 weeks and they've got the soft schedule. So that might save the Rockets. I'm not convinced it's going to be 2 weeks. We saw the Fred stuff go on and on and on longer than I think we wanted it to be. But Ben, this is not me doing some 2020 hindsight on Udoka. You know me. I was there at home yelling at my TV at the 9-minute mark, get Amen Sengun out of there, and especially Amen. So I don't know where you are on this with me, but like this was, I was angry about this because I just felt like this should have never happened. And it wasn't even also about the ankle. I'm just like, we got to save this guy minutes wherever you can save him minutes, because obviously Udoka thinks he's the best player on the Rockets.
Yeah, he does. And I think the latter point is the distinction I would make, that it's more about the minutes than the injury, because the injury itself, this was not a hamstring or a calf just going out, an overuse injury in which it's a routine movement, but because he's playing 36, 38 minutes per night, the muscle was prone to doing that. No, this was landing on a guy's foot after releasing a shot and his ankle turning 90 degrees. That can happen in practice. It can happen in a gym run. It can happen anywhere. So the nature of the injury itself was just terrible luck. And if it didn't happen there, it could have happened in the next day's practice or shoot around just the same.
But obviously, it did happen because he was playing.
Right. I know. I'm just saying it could have happened somewhere else. And to me, it's analogous to the argument of saying, oh, no one should go into an office because someone can get in a car crash on their way to work. No, there are some just occupational hazards that we accept on a daily basis. With that said, I do agree with your point about the minutes, because I did notice in February, it felt like he was less impactful on the defensive end of the court than he was in January. And I think the difference is in January, that was his first month at the NBA level, playing true starters minutes, 36 to 38 per night, as opposed to most of his career. And the first 3 months of this year, he was closer to the 28 to 30 range. So I would have to dig deeper into the data to confirm that. But by the eye test, yeah, it did look like there was some slippage. So my preference would be, if you can get him out and save him the starters minutes by not playing in the fourth quarter, do it. This is not Minnesota where, the Rockets blew that 16-point lead with 4 minutes left. This is a much larger lead against a much worse team. So I'm in agreement with you on the minutes total. I don't think it was directly linked with the injury itself, but yeah, I think they should prioritize, if you can get Amen out at 30 minutes and not stretch him to 36 or 38, do it. I think the way the Rockets would respond is, hey, we want a ball handler on the court. And Amen, because of his ability to do so many different things, to handle the ball, to defend, to be versatile on both ends of the court, he helps our other young guys who are playing, guys like Cam Whitmore, be in a better position to succeed in those minutes. You can make the argument. I just think it is dwarfed by the minutes factors and what it can mean if a guy like that gets worn down or worse, gets hurt. So I understand what they were thinking, but yes, I do wish they were more aggressive. I know Ime said, oh, I don't do wholesale line changes. And, they had taken out 2 guys before, and Amen and Jabari were coming out at the next dead ball. Come on, if you're up 28, 30 points, you can do a wholesale line change.
2 timeouts again. I'll throw that in again. There were 2 timeouts. There was I think at the 9 or 10 minute mark and the 7 minute mark, there were timeouts.
And Chris Mannix of SI has a new column that came out Thursday talking about, big picture, how far the Rockets have come. And he got some exclusive interviews with Ime and Rafael Stone. And one of the quotes that stood out the most to me, Ime says, this is the deepest team that I've been around in the NBA, even deeper than the team he took to the NBA Finals in Boston, and I assume he's referring to his years as an assistant with the Spurs, including that 2014 title team. So if the team is that deep and you trust guys like, we've talked about Cam Whitmore a lot, but you've also got some veterans near the end of that bench, Jock Landale, Aaron Holiday, Jay-Sean Tate. If you really believe this team is that deep, then a wholesale line change when you're up 25, 30 points is not that big of a deal. So I do push back on that a little bit. I think that is being a little too cautious. I don't know that it necessarily bit them here and that the injury itself was freaky. But yes, I do think that generally speaking, they should be a little more proactive with using those end of the bench guys, especially because you've got these veterans. Throw Jeff Green into that mix as well, that Ime says that he really likes and trusts. Okay, use them a little bit more, because even young guys can get to a point where the minutes take a toll. I think we saw it. We talked about Alperen Sengun being better since the All-Star break. What happened? He got to rest. He's much more fresh. And I think even with young guys, 82 games is a lot. They're not used to playing and having that much mileage relative to college, international ball, whatever the case may be. So, yeah, that's one area where I think sometimes there's too much of a just play the hits, to go back to that mantra that I expressed earlier, just get through the game. No, there are some longer term factors at play that I think the Rockets just haven't fully accounted for most of the season, because they're in so much of a just get this win by all means necessary mode.
Yeah, and this is not the first time I was frustrated with Udoka last year. I just thought he played Fred too many minutes. I mean, Fred was near the top of the league at minutes the whole time. I get Fred's impact on the Rockets last year, but at the same time, if you're a good coach, you got to be able to steal 3 or 4 extra minutes. He shouldn't have been playing 36, 37 near the top of the league last year, Fred, and then he gets hurt in the middle of the year, and then you don't have him for 2 or 3 weeks. They were terrible when he was gone. And to me, it's worth it to steal 2 or 3 minutes a game. It's going to impact you less than not having him for several games. That's the problem, is like, this is not the first time it's happened. And Fred, of course, Ben, as you know, he came to the Rockets with a lot of minutes at Toronto, and he was getting injured every year there, and he's not a big guy to begin with. So the impact of a lot of games and a lot of minutes wasn't going to help. Now, this year, he backed off the minutes. I think the ankle was a little bit more freak this year, but it's not the first time. I'm just saying with
yeah, it's fair. I would just say these 2 years in Houston, to go back to the earlier point, have been very focused on maintaining an unexpected jump. Last year, I don't think people expected them to get to 500 in year one. They did. I don't think most people this year expected them to clearly be in the top 6. They are. And so when you're ahead of schedule and you start off so strong, there's a lot of pressure internally to stay where you are, to not fall off. And I think you made the OKC parallel. The difference there is OKC won 57 games last year, and they're going to win something in the 60s this year. There's a much larger buffer. And so I think and hope, the optimistic way that I'm going to try and frame this and spin this, is that as the Rockets in the years ahead get much more comfortable with where they are as an organization, get much more confident that the situation is not as tenuous as it's felt at times the last 2 years, you'll see more of a strategic long-term focus and approach from the coaching staff. I think some of what's happened, I'm not saying that it's not a mistake. You can make a fair argument that it is. I'm just saying I understand where it comes from. The idea that it's very fragile. To go back to a quote Ime had a few weeks ago, a fragile ecosystem. And I think he errs on the side of playing guys that he trusts in roles that he trusts, because it doesn't feel like they're secure in where they are. And hopefully, as this thing turns into what they hope is a sustainable contender, the Rockets get to a point where they're more strategic, they're more long-term focused, and you're not playing Amen Thompson with 6 minutes left in a 30-point game.
Just a fun question here towards the end. If you could go back into a time machine and use a time machine and see any Rockets game in history in person, which game would you go back and see?
I would choose the 1986 Western Conference Finals Game 5. And I'm assuming, by the way, let me clarify, Robert. So I go back and I am in that moment, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, like I can't see the future.
That's up to you. I'm gonna let. I'm thinking in terms of, because if I were to do it, I would go to a game where I know that when I go back, I know the future, because it would be kind of fun to like, oh, I can know that this is going to be a great moment at going into it.
Yeah. Well, no. That game. I mean, what happens after that game? Like, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the reason I would pick, and there's different criteria you can use, but I would pick Game 5 of the '86 Western Conference Finals, which I was far too young. I was 1 year old at the time. But the Ralph Sampson shot to get to the NBA Finals, just the second one in team history on a buzzer beater against the Lakers, one of the probably the storybook franchise of the NBA, on their home court against Magic, against Kareem, and with it being year 2 of Hakeem Olajuwon. So you have a superstar, a homegrown superstar from the University of Houston in year 2, and you beat NBA royalty on the road to go to the NBA Finals, and it feels like the entire future is set. Now, we know it didn't happen because what ends up happening, Ralph Sampson's career gets derailed by injuries. There's off-court concerns with a lot of those 80s Rockets, and it takes 8 more years until 94 for the Rockets and Hakeem to truly get to a championship level. But at that time, in '86, you had to feel like when that shot went in the Western Conference Finals, that you were set up for a dynasty. And so I would love to, again, I was 1 year old at the time, so I did not, watch this live or contextualize it at all. But I feel like that would be the peak as a sports fan, to be on the front end of what looks like a dynasty and a winning shot at the buzzer by Ralph Sampson to send you to the NBA Finals. To me, that would be everything. And again, the criteria that I sort of went into this using is, of course, I know what's going to happen, or that something special is going to happen in that game, but I don't know what's going to happen in the future, because obviously that version of the Rockets, other than Hakeem, completely turned over by the time they won championships 8 and 9 years later. But at the time, it felt like that was the start of a potential dynasty. And so when I look back historically, that's the one I would love to be at the forum, hear the hush, and of course the screams of the Rockets players celebrating when you win at the buzzer to go to just the second NBA Finals in team history.
Yeah, I don't know if I told you this story, but I was 14. I was a freshman in high school at the time. And I would want to be there because guess what? I fell asleep because that game was so late at night. It was like,
oh yeah, LA. Yeah.
It ended at, it seemed like it ended after midnight, or because it was one of those like television games, and I forget when it started, but it was, I fell asleep in my bedroom and I woke up the next day and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I missed this. But I was excited, but I was still, I just was mad at myself for falling asleep, but I was 14 years old and going to high school. What last thing? You and I usually just talk Rockets, but I know you got the eyes on the Texans. What's the equivalent of the Kenyon Green, CJ Gardner Johnson deal? Is this like Deshaun Nix for Tari Eason, or am I disrespecting Kenyon Green at all?
No, it's a pretty great deal. At least from where I sit, I just love what Nick Caserio has done this week, because it felt like watching from afar that the culture just wasn't right in that room. It wasn't just about the execution and what the PFF grade is for each of those guys. It just looked like, for one reason or another, the vibes were bad. The energy was bad. I didn't like the finger pointing and the excuse making when guys were asked about it. It just felt like, and Tunsil's the guy I look at the most because he's the veteran. He's paid the most. He's supposed to be the leader. But across the board, it wasn't just about blocks that get made or don't get made. It felt like they were never in sync. It felt like the culture wasn't right. And so I'm just relieved they're going to try again. I don't know that it's going to be better in terms of, the guys that bring in, what's their PFF grade going to be compared to the guys who went out. But I just, again, for a team that has stressed culture ever since DeMeco Ryans took over and has what I believe to be very good culture in most spots, that was the exception to the rule. There were some very confounding things. I think the discipline penalties play into that as well. Even if there's not a clear day one upgrade on the line, I'm just glad they're trying again, because even if the ability isn't that much better, I think you can get a much more passable team result simply if the attitudes are better. And I think that's what they're trying to do. And so I'm just relieved that, I don't know who they're going to start next year on the line. I don't know how good they're going to profile by the metrics, but I just think that the odds are a lot better that it's going to be a more watchable group, a more likable group. And I think at the end of the day, that's going to be a better result for the team.
And connecting it to the Rockets, we see the chemistry this year with this Rockets team. You want to see that kind of chemistry with the Texans offensive line. He's at Ben DuBose on X. Anything you want to plug, Ben?
No, just Ben DuBose on Twitter/X and RocketsWire.usatoday.com for all the daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
As always, appreciate the time, brother. MIZ.
ZOU.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.